Okay, so welcome everybody here to this parallel session. And it's on a very important subject, right? That is how to finance all the wonderful things that we have seen during the last 2 days. If just go back about an hour, Edith Hertz presenting her immense effort during the COVID pandemic, but beyond that, to bring data to the structural biology community and beyond. That's great, but it needs funds. And for us who are more in physical infrastructures like CERN or myself, I'm the Director General of the ESS and have before been the Director of the Institut Langevin in Grenoble. We have to finance these multi-billion projects before we even can produce the data. So the subject that we want to discuss a little bit here today is what are currently the difficulties that we are facing, what are the extremely positive things that we have experienced over the last years, and how could we get rid of eventual bottlenecks so that in the future we can provide everybody with even better and more sustainable data. So with that, we will have a listeners panel here, and everybody will present their facility in the light of the subject that you see on the screens briefly, and then we will engage into a discussion. And I really would like then to encourage you to come up with questions from your side. So please challenge us to make this a very lively session. So I first would like to ask Bonnie Wolf-Bönisch, Director, Consortium of European Social Science Data Archives, to say a little bit, Bonnie, what you are doing and put your facility in the context of this session, please.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind invitation and to speak at this crucial topic on long-term financing for sustainable research infrastructure. Yes, I would like to share my perspective of CESTA-ERIC, the Consortium of Social Science Data Archives, which is one of the 25 ESRI research infrastructure and one out of 3 social science research infrastructure. In my short presentation, I will focus on 3 cost types which occur with research data management, since CESTA is a distributed, data-driven research infrastructure. Also, I realized that when I wrote this now is also, you can read also now the description of the cost also as a summary or strategic priorities where I think for in the data, research data management where we should finance. So first of all, we heard now the cost of fair data and crucial how important it is to make data findable, accessible, interoperable and usable. And yes, investing in data infrastructure requires financial resources as you include the whole research data cycle, but where I see a lot of resources are needed is in the curating of the data, and we had also its data and digital objects to make these data discoverable and usable for researchers. And of course, data that cannot be found by scientists, citizens or decision makers hamper the sharing of knowledge and innovation. But also I think it's important to acknowledge that even data is deposit, but if you can't use it because of poor quality, missing contextualization, it's a waste actually of precious resources. So that's why it's important to invest into make the data speak to each other and comprehensive metadata and frameworks of operability. The other cost of will occur is in research data management experts, upskilling on a broader level at the institutional, national and the European level. We in CESTA, we have experts from the 22 member countries, and they play an important role in organizing and curating document data to ensure long-term preservation and usability. But these costs include personal salaries, training programs, and the development and implementation of data policies and workflows. And I can say from my experiences at CESTA is that we have a huge demand on requests also to help other research infrastructures. But because of lack of resources, we are not able to cater actually to all these needs and interests. The costs are for the long-term preservation of data. I will keep it short. I think my colleagues will have a lot to say about that. But yes, in these cost items, you have to take into account data storage systems, hardware capable of handling large volumes of data, safeguarding research data against unauthorized access, data breaches, loss, and compliance with data protection regulation and ethical guidelines. And to conclude, yes, I think it's important to recognize that the cost of long-term data preservation are investments that will yield significant benefits in the future. And it's important to acknowledge also that failing to allocate adequate resources for long-term preservation will lead to loss of valuable research outputs and hinder scientific progress. And finally, I would also like to mention the cost in the cost equation of research infrastructure. The cost of not managing research data, and which has been mentioned by Michael Arentoft this morning. Yes, leaving the field of innovation to others, or the risk of dependence of the supply from third parties in the data economy. So that's why I would like to emphasize that it's essential for institutions, funding bodies, policymakers, and the researchers together to define the roles and responsibilities and to make data available in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you very much. So then I go over to Kimmo Koski, Director of the Finnish IT Center for Science. So, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. You know, it's only some 3-4 minutes time, a lot of things to say. Fortunately, I'm a Finn, because you know the stereotype of the Finns is that we don't talk much, if we talk at all. So 3-4 minutes, it's actually not the presentation, it's the workshop, right? But I try to address some of these things and using actually CSC, the IT Center for Science, the Finnish National Center, as an example. I was asked to give some that how do we try to tackle the sustainability issues, and of course because much of the funding in our area is project-based. I mean the EU funding and also the national funding many times. Then of course there are times, okay. So during the project, one should actually think about what happens after the project and who funds the service. That is, for example, the outcome of the project. And that's not always easy and sometimes even forgotten. So how do we do in a small country like Finland? How do we try to tackle the sustainability? Okay, so in this area, one of the obvious things is that if you are a small country, you can't distribute everything. It's a centralization is one of these topics. So I think CSC is probably, or the Finnish model is probably the most centralized in Europe, because everything is under the same roof, CSC. And that's for the historical reasons only, also, but also from other stuff. So, and it's a, let's say it's an intentional strategy from the ministry, for example, to support this kind of sustainable entity. So CSC is working actually in 3 areas mainly. One is the research computing, from supercomputers to networks and everything in between. The second one is data at large. I mean, not only research data, but data for education, for example, data for culture, like libraries, museums, archives, etc. And the third one is a digital transformation of the universities. And it's all together something like 630 people, so half of them probably working pretty much with the research. So it's a critical mass is there. So with this you can also, because there is a budget line, we make contract with the ministry, for example, to providing the services centrally to universities and University of Applied Sciences. That actually makes it pretty sustainable. Even though in some of the areas there still is an issue that when the project ends, because part of it's project money, what's happening next. And I think today we should discuss maybe in the European level what can be done also in order to ease this challenge a little bit, and how can we provide sustainability also beyond the project. Maybe then a couple of examples what has been happening lately also is because also in the supercomputing area, for example, it's every 5 years you need to invest a lot of money for this, let's say the next device to keep the research sustainability going on. And then it's also uncertainty. Do you get it on time, or you need to lob for the money, and then okay, it comes 1 year later. Some of the researchers disappear to some other areas, some other infrastructures and so on. So that has been the traditional way for maybe several decades in Finland too, and that has some kind of challenges. Even though it's usually successful, it has uncertainties. But now for the first time in our history, for example, we have a budget line, sustainable budget line also for the supercomputing purchases. I mean, we can plan it much more optimally, and also we know that there is a continuation. So instead of one big lump sum, there is every year something that also provides for the networks and specialist work on that. And the second, maybe the last example is for the development. What has happened now, you probably, most of you know the Lumi supercomputer was presented there too. So that has been working, well, some parts of it has been working 1.5 years, and now it's still life to go. But in Finland now we have a new government, and the government program, for example, was published last Friday, so a couple of days ago, and already there it states that there is a commitment to the follow-up of the Lumi. While it doesn't say details on money and the timing, etc., but there is a firm commitment that we started something that we're going to continue. So how can we here in Europe actually, in different countries, to or extend the time of the planning, I mean, in a sustainable way? That is, I think, some key thing. I don't have a solution for that, but I'm sure that after this hour, everything is clear, right? Okay.
That was a lot of words for a Finn. So then we move over to Christoph Kuhn from a different area, from the European Investment Bank. So Christoph, what is your take on financing infrastructures?
Thank you very much, and good morning from my side. I'm taking a slightly different view, the view from a banking perspective on research infrastructure, which, if you think about, is a bit strange, because research infrastructures historically is a public sector driven business. It's financed by governments, regions and institutes, and therefore a bank is not a natural counterpart here. But we have been a partner to research infrastructures, both at university but also at European level, since a very long time. We in EIB are partnering since the beginning of the S3 agenda, but actually already since 2000, with research institutes and organizations and governments to improve financing conditions and make available finance. I think ESS is a good example, and we have providing substantial amounts to back up this project at early stage. I think it was quite important that we were there. And I think that's really our role here. Our role is to give stability and give visibility to the availability of finance. Because often when you deal with public budgets, you have annual budget cycles that provide not always the most certain background to actually plan for a longer term. And here we can play a role, and this was our role here. We also provided finance for CERN. We provided finance for the ESRF in Grenoble. So all the very large research infrastructures, we have been a partner, and the objective was clearly that. Now, why are we actually doing that as a bank? And I think here comes the DNA of the EIB at play. We are really here to make Europe a more competitive place. We're here to make Europe more inclusive and bring in also regions that normally do not benefit from very large investments. And we are also here to make investments more sustainable. And all these three elements play a crucial role when it comes to supporting research infrastructures. Maybe just a last word, what do we actually do when we look at an infrastructure project in the area of research? What do we assess? What is the decisive factor for us to finance or not to finance? And it's essentially four key components. One is the alignment of this infrastructure with the EU and national research agenda. So we make sure that whatever is put in place actually fits the priorities at EU level, but also at the national level. Secondly, we are looking at the nature of the investment and making sure that they are in line with best practices, also when it comes to procurement, but not only, also when it comes to environmental and social standards. Especially the environmental standards become more and more important, and we can say later on a few words on this. And then lastly, we look also at the economic situation. Sometimes research infrastructures can actually also generate cash flows and can actually provide additional capacity to raise finance. And we are trying to help here and assess the situation to provide then the right financing structure, so that also the public budget is optimized when it comes to using it for the investment at place. Let me just say, and I want to reiterate one message that we just heard. We as EIB, we always finance primarily the hard assets, so the infrastructure per se. We are not so much, actually it's very exceptional that we can provide finance for a small portion for the operational expenses. And that often is actually the bigger problem than financing the hard assets. So it's something that also I would like to put maybe forward as a topic for discussion later on, how to solve these problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for the support to the ESS, naturally. So Bob Jones from CERN, but also wearing the hat of member of the board of EOSC. So Bob, what is your take on this subject?
Well, it's always difficult speaking after a banker for finance, right? But thank you very much, Christoph. Sustainability, well, next year CERN celebrates 70 years of existence as an intergovernmental organization. It's funded by 23 member states, not all European member states, but member states, with an annual budget of approximately 1.1 billion Swiss francs in total. So that's coming from the member states in terms of a link to their GDP. Okay? Our flagship accelerator, the Large Hadron Collider, has been running for 15 years now. We have to keep upping the numbers of the data it produces. So in 2022, it produced approximately 30 petabytes of data. And overall, we are managing approximately an exabyte now. So that's accumulated since the machine came online. Of course, most of that data we cannot make openly available. What are you going to do with an exabyte of data? You're not going to download it to your laptop, right? So we have to put in place other structures to make this data fair and accessible. We have the CERN Open Data Portal, where it's open to anyone, primarily used in research, in education, at universities, at schools as well. And one of the major costs in making that data available is the actually packaging it for people who are not involved in the experiments. If you remember, when the Higgs boson was discovered, it was a combination of two of the experiments from the LHC, ATLAS and CMS. ATLAS alone is 3,000 people. They are not CERN employees. Those are coming from all over Europe and beyond Europe as well. So there is contributions in terms of sustainability because CERN doesn't own the experiments. We only own the accelerator. Okay? The experiments are these collaborations. So there's lots of contributions in kind and financially from around the world to build these experiments. And they themselves have plannings of decades. So there's a long-term undertaking. The other parts that you're probably aware of as well is, of course, CERN has its own open science policy published. You can see that on the web. The same thing as well for open data. We have an obligation through this policy to make our data available within 5 years. It might sound like a long time, but as I said, the effort needed to package not only the data, but the software and the information so that other people can actually make use of it requires a lot of effort. Beyond the CERN Open Data Portal, you're probably more aware of Zenodo. Probably many of you use it. It is a digital repository open to everybody, not just for physics, from around the world, hosted at CERN, funded and operated by CERN, but also with contributions from the European Commission, from the open air structure for the R&D. So our operations are all covered by CERN budget, but research and development comes from industry and also from the European Commission. So that's the sort of situation we have for CERN, and we'll be talking to Christoph again. We want to build our next accelerator. But looking at the European Open Science Cloud, said I'm a member of the board of directors of the association. The association combines a membership of more than 200 members and observer organizations from all across Europe. And the way that the whole structure is financed, there's some funding from the membership fees to set up the association, but that only runs the association and the work we need to do to put in place the policies and the activities. It does not cover the operation of EOSC. That was never intended through the fees, right? What has been put in place is a co-programmed partnership with the European Commission over the full lifetime of Horizon Europe, and the total commitment from the European Commission and from the members of the association amounts to approximately 1 billion euros over the lifetime of Horizon Europe. So 470, I think, million coming from the European Commission and the rest coming from the members. And the good news is it's actively progressing. We can see through the monitoring that's going on, there is commitments from the members across Europe to build the European Open Science Cloud. Okay? One of the things I think that's important to look at there for the research infrastructures, we have a special task force set up working with the research infrastructures. Jana has mentioned one of the task forces that the working groups is going on already. And I think one has to look at that from a research infrastructures point of view, that there are a number of roles that research infrastructures can have in the European Open Science Cloud. Yes, there are excellent services and data sets and science results which are produced by the research infrastructures, and they are contributing those. The other side is that they are also the important links to user communities. Okay? So those two things together are helping to expand what the European Open Science Cloud represents, because we see it as adding a layer, as Carol Lubin, our president, highlighted yesterday. It's adding a layer which goes beyond the discipline or national specifics, but broadens it all the way across Europe to promote open science and the fair data policies. And I think that's my 3 minutes.
Thank you, Bob. So, so before we open up the discussion, I would just like to say a couple of words about the ESS perspective. So I hope most of you had a nice bus ride up there yesterday and could get a glimpse of the facility. We apologize, we could not get you to the heart of the facility because that would have required that you put on protective equipment, sturdy shoes and vests and so on, and we couldn't fit that in within this short time frame. The ESS is a neutron facility, and Europe was leading the field of neutron science for the last 50 years. This is because in Europe we have a network of facilities, both national and international. The international flagship is the ILL in Grenoble, but then there's facilities in the UK, ISIS, PSI in Switzerland, MLZ in Munich, and other sources, smaller sources, for example, in Hungary and so on. So the ESS is meant to take over from the ILL as the flagship over the next decade. It's a project of a value of a little bit more than 3 billion euros, so we are talking real money. And I think what was really important from the EIB was that we managed the cash flow, and that was essential. But I think also, as Christoph has said, the project funding is probably the easier part in the long run, because facilities like that are around for 40, 50 years. And they need an annual budget that we estimate for the ESS at the moment at 200 million. And we are financed by 13 member states, and they bring in their contributions, and we renew their contracts periodically. And so that will be a challenge. When it comes to data, I think we had an excellent presentation yesterday morning, how you get from the raw data to what something that we as human beings can digest, like images and concepts that then allow us to take decisions that lead to innovation or a better competitiveness. We have all that at the ESS. I think an aspect I would like to mention, and that's certainly true for CERN even to a higher degree, is the machine itself is a huge digital enterprise, right? We will have at the ESS 10 million variables that we have to control. So that creates terabytes of data every day. And with artificial intelligence, we would like to make our machine more reliable by using these data, treating those data, and then piloting the machine. On the user side, our challenge is a little bit different, I think, from yours, because we have this huge user community. So we have people that look at the origin of the universe, fundamental physicists, then we have chemists, physicists, and then we go into the engineering disciplines, we go into structural biology, health, pharmaceuticals, and end up with artifacts and cultural heritage. And all these people cannot use the raw data. They want to have the digested data. And so for us to treat these, it's great to be democratic, is an enormous burden, right? That we try to shoulder only as a community with the rest of the facilities. Yeah, that in a nutshell, the ESS out there in Lund trying to have great insight in the future in materials and processes at the highest level of excellence. So with that, maybe I launched the discussion with a question, and that comes from my personal experience over the last years. The funders, when they fund, they have a certain interest, and that is normal because most of them distribute taxpayers' money, and the taxpayers ask their politicians, well, what are you doing with that money? What is the return for our societies? And this is not always in line with what we would like to do for scientific excellence, right? We might have access proportional to the contributions from the member states and things like that. So do you feel that this is in general an issue? And also the question, I mean, we have seen today every euro put into those infrastructures generates 106. If I remember, it was actually pounds, but that should have, the ratio is the same. So if that is done in another country that is not contributing at all, or another continent that is even competing with us, is that an issue? And do you feel in your areas that this is an issue, and how can we deal with it?
Okay, I'll start if you want. So certainly it's something that's taken into account at CERN in the work we do there. So there's the whole question of return on investment for the member states. And there are different channels through which that happens. First of all, CERN procures for approximately 1/3 of a billion of Swiss francs per year. So the member states in our procurement policies are in a privileged position in order to bid with their companies to get some of those contracts for the construction, for the materials, for the services, and so on. The other part that was mentioned quite clearly by Edith in the presentation this morning was the training aspect. That's seen as very valuable to the member states in terms of how we train their personnel, not only in physics, but in computing and in lots of different engineering disciplines as well. And then finally, as well, I would say knowledge transfer in terms of how can they make use of the innovation that happens at research infrastructures like CERN to return those. And I think those aspects, we will also see those coming up in the decision-making around the European Open Science Cloud. The contributors to the European Open Science Cloud will also want to see that there is some return on investment for them. And I think looking at things like promoting, we've talked a lot already about the training needed around open science, things like that. I think that's one of the areas where the European Open Science Cloud can contribute as well.
Thank you, Bob. Kimmo, you want to join in?
Yeah, that's a wide topic, so wide topic that even the Finnish 3 minutes is not enough. But I mean, I would like to highlight a couple of points which I think are important. I mean, first of all, for example, I'm running a national center in Finland, but practically all the other countries, they have either a centralized or distributed model. So there are a number of similar entities, and of course in European level we sometimes compete about the European funding. For example, in Euro HPC we were competing, but more than competition we do collaboration. So much of these are working together, and I'm wondering that if we want to develop it further, I mean, it's always easy to ask questions and not being able to give solutions, but necessarily yet. But I think something what we would need to think about is that instead of just project funding, because there are these centers and they are more or less sustainable, and there are also centers like research infrastructures like CERN, ESO, etc., and yours. so who have capabilities and so on. So can we find ways somehow to federate these already quite sustainable elements more and do things together? There are good signs to the right direction, like for example when Euro-HPC is now joint undertaking and also funds infrastructure, so it increases sustainability. Would like to very much to hear Bob's and everybody's opinions. What's going to happen to EOSC, for example? Would that be an element where we can gather things together and do it? We used to have things like praise, for example. We still have praise, of course, and this, but sometimes with this experience of this 20 years in there is a lot of good things are done, but then how also to make it easy and simple instead of when things grow they might get slower and bureaucratic. So we should also tackle the ways we are handling the things.
Thank you.
Yeah. So
Boni?
Yeah, since CESTA is of course a distributed research infrastructure, the challenges are not as comparative as CERN and the newer research infrastructure. However, of course, we are also questioned by the return of investment of social science data. And one of the return of investment, I think, is really the fair data, research data management expertise of our organization, where we transfer knowledge to other research infrastructure, especially those who are in the S3 preparatory phase, for example. Then also a potential which hasn't been fully tapped on, but there is a full potential, is increasingly policy advice, having the data on using for recommendation to policies, but on the broader field also cross-disciplinary on health policies or life science policies. This is something we haven't fully tapped, but yeah, that's something we can argue the return of investment. And perhaps also there is indirectly a good reason for CESTA to value indirectly at the national level, not necessarily on a European level, but on the national level in the sense that there is a strong expertise also in curating or managing sensitive data. And that's something sometimes difficult for us to trace because in certain countries we receive only 10% of social science data in CESTA because 90% actually remains in the national level because it's sensitive and micro data. But it's very interesting also for researchers in the future to tap it in. So yes, that's basically our potential, how we could argue return of investment.
Any opinion from the European Investment Bank on the subject?
Well, I think a lot has been said. I think the return on investment is absolutely crucial for any partner to put money into this, and there are different sources for that. I do, however, also believe that the European dimension into research infrastructures, and that could come indeed from the EU budget, it could come from the whole European research infrastructure community that necessarily is embedded in at least the very large ones, plus also indeed financing from EIB, sort of mitigates a little bit this national place. Because of course then you bring it to a European level. It doesn't completely get away with that because indeed there must be the return on investment. But I think the European interest, especially when EU member states, but often it's not only EU member states, but when partners come together, the more you sign up to common values and enshrine that in the statutes and in the governance, the more you mitigate then that afterwards there are problems with national interests. And
is there a stronger role for the European Union? I mean, in my domain, we had framework programs where a strong accent was placed on facilitating access for everybody in the European Union to those research infrastructures, but actually it was a drop into the ocean every time. It was helpful, but so would there be a need for a real push without compromising, let's say, the sovereignty of those infrastructures?
So I think you have to look at it from 2 points of view there, right? There is, as you say, there's the operational question, and then there's the investments in the planning and the construction phases. And traditionally the Commission and the European Union has been more involved in the planning and construction phases. Yep. Operations has been the responsibility of the stakeholders themselves, right? There's a mix there of the way it works. I think it's also linked to, as Christoph said, the question of can you invest in tangible assets or not as well? Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the return on investment is also during the operations phase and not
Exactly.
just during the construction. So I think there's interest from the members to contribute to the operations as well.
So there would be maybe something for S3 to look into and make sure that the operations in the long run is sustainable. Because operations is a little bit more than just operations. People think you just keep it going. If you don't invest into an infrastructure, right, I would say about 10% of its budget every year, very soon it's not competitive. And so operations also means to make sure that these enormous investments, they are at the forefront over the full life cycle of the facility.
Maybe I could add as well that in the context of the European Open Science Cloud, that's what's being looked at the moment as well. There's understood there has to be some operations to perform things. There's elements going on at the moment. The European Commission has launched a procurement to look at some of the core services and what was described this morning by Michael as the EC node in there as well. But it's understood that in parallel, there will have to be ongoing grants and development to ensure that those services remain fit for purpose and ready for the future developments. There's a lot of talk around about making the services AI ready. And so this is activities that need to be done in a development cycle as well.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. Bonnie, go.
Perhaps I jump in, it's short. But yeah, also for CESTA, we have the main challenge, even if it's on a smaller scale, as I said, that one thing is maintaining, but it's also the development of tools and services. And scientists have also new needs. So, and the needs will become also increasingly more complex, and that's where also it can't necessarily covered by just membership contributions. So yeah.
So I think we should open it up for the audience. Is there questions from your side? Could we trigger some questions at least by, yeah. I think you were first, Jose.
My question, thank you very much for the presentation. My question is about how ideas you can really provide respect to the operational costs. I completely agree that really let's say, most of the tension in the system is coming from the operational budget of the facilities. So good idea could be there. I mean, could be ideas in the sense that we have to, let's say, to fix a cap between all the facilities. So that means at the end of the day, when you want to open something, you have to close something in order to keep more or less constant. We have to, this idea coming from Finland also, that maybe you can add a little more at the typical annual contribution in order to save money, and the facility will be something like a buffer and to be used every 10 years. Or could be ideas related, but I suppose it's completely different if you are single site or distributed, because single site, as a return of investment for the country who hosts could be significant. But when you are really truly distributed, so there are no costs. Yeah. So, and also the point is, the different countries, usually in Europe at least, are different timelines from the financial point of view. And when some countries are able to put some money because of circumstances or better economy in that moment, the other not. And the other, so could be some kind of a la carte. And again, the facilities make like a buffer, because we heard that the European Investment Bank is not in the area of the operational in general, I will say. So I would like if you have some ideas about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe if I comment some of these points. So of course, yeah. One of the things is how to make it attractive, as you mentioned. Or if I use this Finnish example, so we make these sustainable the CSC services, for example, attractive to universities and research centers, because they're using critical mass, which means that actually the unit prices are cheaper than if they would do it separately themselves. So that's one of the things. Maybe in European level we should also do that, but of course thinking about that in different parts of Europe there are different strengths. Well, for example, if the electricity cost in Lumi 50 euros per megawatt hour, somewhere 300, so there is obvious gain there. So we could do more in the kind of specialization in European level too. But I mean, well, it's of course something that you can't solve everything at the same time. But already starting from some pieces where you can actually join things together. I think I didn't answer much of your question, but at least partly you're raising that. Yeah.
I don't know, was Bonnie or Bob?
You want to go?
No, Bob.
Okay.
You're okay. Bob,
Okay.
Bob, please go ahead.
Considering the operations, when I talked about the data we have at CERN, what you have to understand, we have a data center on CERN, a 4 megawatt data center, nowhere near the size of the CSC centers, but 4 megawatts. But that only provides about 15% of the capacity we need to process the LHC data. The rest of it is done in a distributed manner all around the world. So there's something called the LHC computing grid that's been running now for 15 years. There's about 170 data centers around the world in 42 countries. And one of the reasons that that got set up was exactly so that the organizations and the governments could invest in their own country. They didn't have to invest on material on the CERN side. So they're all contributing in terms of compute capacity, storage, and so on, across an overall network in which the GEON network that Eric mentioned yesterday, that's the basis for how we put together the LHC computing grid. And those are pledges, but there's no exchange of money going on between the different countries, right? They're sort of in-kind contribution pledges, and we track that. And that works very, very well. It's been running for many years. But one thing which is coming back maybe for Kimmo as well, is that having done this for so long, we realize there are some opportunities for minimizing the operational costs with such a structure. For example, there's been a set of software and services dedicated for the LHC which have been deployed across these centers. Now, a different research infrastructure, ESS, EMBL, and so on, they will also have their sets of services that they need to operate. And many of the centers, like CSC, will be doing it for lots of different disciplines. So if they have to deploy many sets of similar but different services performing similar functions, it's an operational overhead for these guys as well. So we've seen over time, if we can start to move towards appropriate standards in that domain, we can look for economies of scale in the operational elements of this. And I think this is one of the areas where the European Open Science Cloud can help, because one of its goals is to try and bring together some of these standards from across the different disciplines.
Thank you, Bob. Bonnie?
Yeah. From the perspective of CESTA, since the keyword was à la carte, very practical now. We at the moment we will revisit our technical roadmap, and as it looks like that we may not be able to implement everything because we don't have all the resources for doing so. But so we play internally with different models. So we have of course calls for in-kind contribution. Or there are now groups of different countries who may discuss co-funding models for certain services and tools, which then can be given to the broader community, to all the to the members. But so that's a bit where as a distributed research infrastructure we play around. But one of my points I wanted to say, especially because we're hammering out now that FAIR is important and we need investment. If research infrastructure should have to be upscaled for this. Not everybody has the resources, so the upscaling on FAIR data, I think there should be also some extra funding for this digitalization of research infrastructure. We are not so far, like we discussed.
Short Finnish addition before I go on to the next question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so just I forgot to say one thing is just for the thinking for future. As an example, for example, we have a project called EUDAT, and then we made a project called EUDAT 2, and promised not to make 3, but make it sustainable. So we established a company, but many of the stakeholders or players are actually institutes or part of the university or something like that. And turned out that not so many could participate in a company because the decision, well, they just can't do it. And so it's a quite small scale, and much of the synergy, which would have been funding the operations, after the project phase, was not really achieved. So there is something we should do. I mean, find the ways that the European stakeholders could actually participate in this kind of event.
Thank you very much. So now,
yes. So
question, please. So.
Robert Feidenhans, the European XFEL. We are one of the Aerofoam institutions. We also produce an immense amount of data, something like 20 to 30 petabyte every year. And we actually have it in our operation budget, how to deal with that, because that was actually into the planning. But we are now coming to the stage where it's getting more and more difficult. And I think it's not only black and white, because you also have to look on how do you actually store and maintain data, because data, it's what is low probability to be used and what is high probability. Yeah. What can you store on tape and what you need to have quick access. And I think this needs to be into the discussion in order to get the operational cost contained.
Yes, I think this is a very important question, and that has been discussed already at the conference. I mean, how much data do we keep, and at what point does it not become reasonable anymore to keep those data, right? It's better to get new data if really needed. So any quick reply? Yeah.
So I can. It's a very valid question, and for the upgrades for the accelerators at CERN, we're now in run 3, so the third campaign of running the accelerator, the LHC. It will stop for a year or two. It will then be upgraded to become high luminosity LHC, a factor 10 potential in more data. Some of the questions we're looking at that was raised already yesterday was the idea is how to better filter that data. So at the moment, we're only keeping 1%. The petabytes of data we talk, it's only 1% of what the machine actually produces. But we're looking in the future, will we actually keep the raw data itself? There's always the question of what it would cost to reproduce that. But if we have the summaries and the reconstruction of that data, perhaps that is a mechanism that we can limit how much we can do it. But it's a difficult question to address immediately. Yeah.
So thank you very much. I try now because it's getting interested. Everybody's getting interested. So I speed up a little bit. Please, next question for you.
I would actually, sorry.
Yeah.
I would like to change the topic a little bit because we're talking very much about costs and not so much about financing. And I think that's the topic of today. How do we get to long-term financing? And yes, you have to have an impact story. But there's also, I think, a story about how to distribute funding over the different institutions that have money, like the European Commission, but also the member states. 80% of S3 infrastructures are at the moment distributed. So they're not about CERN or ESS or about XFEL. They're about all these infrastructures that are distributed, that are trying to link data, to annotate data, to contextualize data. At the moment, their costs are relatively low if we compare it to some of the bigger ones, but still these costs has to be distributed. What I'm now seeing, and which is something that's totally annoying to me, that within all the statutes of the ERICs, there are different kind of systems to distribute the funding. And I think it would be good if someone would step up, if it were S3 or the European Commission, but actually come up with maybe 3 or 4 simple methods to distribute those kind of costs, and maybe in some cases add a host fee, because there are some certain perks for host countries, but not to have 20 different systems, because I can't explain that internally. Because if there's a new infrastructure being set up, and they have again a different sort of distribution of a financing system, then my ministry will ask, why is that? And I said, I don't know. Apparently someone came up with someone new and thought it was better. But this is something that doesn't help to get long-term financing for your operations, but also for your construction of the infrastructures.
Thank you. Very, very important point for the distributed infrastructure. Is that to the same topic or? No, okay, then do we have a comment on that, or do we just say that's a sad fact?
I think that there is variations, right? I think what you also have to bear in mind is that when you look at the contributors to these research infrastructures, they're not always the same countries, and they're not always the same ministries. They're not always the same, all in Europe, okay? So the models there are a little bit different. Although I do recall that I think S3 actually produced a report about 2 or 3 years ago looking at the funding models of them with a number of recommendations that came out of that as well. Yeah.
But as a...
Yeah. Okay. Well, I can tell you it's referenced in the Fair Lady document that was produced for the European Open Science Cloud.
Okay, so I think this is a relevant point, but yeah.
It would be good to share it with S3 Forum then at least, and also with the ERIC Forum.
I mean, that's Janne. You want to reply to that?
Well, I'm only in S3 for the last 3 years. Never heard of it. If it's being described, it's different. So there is certainly, according to my knowledge, there's no document that would describe different funding models of European infrastructures. What we currently have is a financing working group that could also look into this. I mean, it's still running, so it's open to a lot of different things.
And I will find the reference for you.
Yes, and if you can send us the reference, so it's certainly, I don't think it's about reviewing of the different business models in details. So it must be about something else, including this.
Okay, so maybe that is really a task, right, there for S3 and this finance working group. I would like to take one from the our audience that is online.
Yeah, so there's been a few questions. I'll pick one of them, and this is slightly changing the topic a little bit. So the question is, how do you perceive the significance of software development in infrastructure projects, transforming the financing landscape, blurring the lines between traditional capital investments in physical structure?
Yeah.
I was very good that somebody raised this topic. So I mean, well, of course, it's important, and we didn't get to one topic yet, which was also in planning this competence development, because even if we would be not competing necessarily that much about the European funding more collaborating, but we will be competing about talents and already now, and software development talents especially. And one tendency, I think, about sustainability, what is also forcing that, especially with these big systems like, for example, number one frontier in US, it's a new like Lumi also, but the second one, Fugaku in Japan, is quite old. And usually to be the supercomputer time frame something like 5 years. But in Japan, they are planning it always almost 10 years, because the huge construction, I think same approach should be also in the large system otherwise. And how do they prolong it? They prolong it because they develop software better. At the moment, the scientific software might be at use only 10% or 15% of the capability of the system, because the software development is difficult, or algorithms don't fit. So we need to invest on the talent and software development so we can actually get much more out of the system, and that also prolongs a little bit to the sustainability factor, in my opinion. Yeah.
Thank you. So next question, please.
My name is Werner Kutscher. I'm from ICOS, also one of the underrepresented distributed research infrastructures, in this case environmental. And I was a bit, I would like to give an idea towards this return of investment, because you need a narrative about the return of investment when it comes to long-term financing. And I've always admired these consultancy companies that then suddenly come up with 11 billion, 10 billion. And what I would like to add here is a specific pattern coming from the environmental research infrastructure. There is, for example, in the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change, a discussion about loss and damage. So when we are providing good information about the environment, we could provide information that preserves and that keeps us away from loss and damage. Yeah. We have 1 billion people, for example, living in cities close to the ocean, and sea level rise may just wipe them out. So if I get an investment into my infrastructure, I cannot come back to the banker and say, here's the value of Amsterdam that was not flooded. Please wipe out my debts for that. But I think it's an important aspect when it comes to the evaluation of the financial or societal value of research infrastructures.
Yeah, I think there were attempts, right, also for insurances to take all these things into account when they calculate risks for insurance premium. And so that would be a first step, not from the bank, but from the insurance to take into account the work that you contribute to risk mitigation and things like that.
Which is what I meant with the policy advice also, no? It's a bit, it's difficult to put a price tag on it. Nations make good decisions based on the data which has been provided.
A lot of hidden outcomes or hidden profits also in this area, which is difficult to calculate, right?
Yeah.
So coming back, my name is Fotis Karagiannis from the S3 and ERG support projects. So coming back to the topic of the costs, I think, in order to deal with the sustainability, it's important to understand costs for both research infrastructures and also infrastructures. And, especially for distributed research infrastructures, the role of, let's say, the understanding the cost models and harmonizing the cost models across the distributed nodes is very important. So I think there should be some more effort in understanding the cost at the national level and also the European level.
Thank you.
Yeah, so on that I can just add that in the context of the European Open Science Cloud Association, there's a task force in place, the Financial Sustainability Task Force, that is looking at the different costs of the parts of the EOSC ecosystem and understanding that there isn't a single funding model which covers all of it. The different components, the core services compared to the exchange, compared to the data infrastructure and so on, they will have different funding models with them and different costs associated with them as well. And
I agree definitely also. I mean, more studies about the cost models, but also the more how we demonstrate the impact. That's another thing which is difficult, but I mean, for example, this return of investment was presented there in the presentation.
Yeah. Thank you. Maybe we have started 5 minutes late, so my last question would be in the current world, right, where we, and I'm not an expert in AI, so I may something that's not completely right here, we can incorporate all the knowledge we have in a gigantic neural network, and then this neural network, the owner of that, gives that information out to the user. So is that changing the game in some sense? And are we, and something we have not touched is at all is the private-public partnerships, right, where a company would make profits from the data that we produce. And it would be fair somehow for our fair data to get some fair return. So what is the reflection, for example, in EOSC on this subject? Because I think part of your mission is also to enhance this, let's say, converting the data into real economic value. But I think it has to be done in a very good way so that it does not go in the wrong direction, right?
Yeah, so I think there's two aspects to it. One, first of all, remember research infrastructures themselves are not only serving the public sector. Many of them do work with the private sector and give access to their facilities, these things. And we have to recognize that exists already. And there are different models around that, right? The other thing for the European Open Science Cloud that was presented this morning was the concept of the data spaces. Okay? And at the moment, there's a number of data spaces being set up where EOSC is considered one for the public research community, but there are other ones for different sectors across the overall economy. Now, certainly the attribution of rights and ownership, and then the benefits from those will have to be taken into account in those different data spaces. But I don't think we're going to have a universal model for all of those different sectors, including the one for the research itself as well.
I would like to take a little other take on artificial intelligence. I think it will help to create new data or new services also for industry and so on, but will be very important still to, again, curate the data, because it will, if not, you will have garbage data or data which has biases. And you will create services which you don't even know what is then the consequences on the long term. So that's why I insist that high quality data, curated data is very important for all the next steps in the future.
Just will the curation in the future also mean that we have to master the algorithms, the AI algorithms, so that we don't depend on a couple of big players that do that for us, that are not even in Europe? Sorry for being a little bit provocative.
No, but I think it's part of the discussion, which I didn't want to open now because we would have a new we can have a new workshop on the topic. But yes, software, algorithm will be part of it.
Okay, with that, I don't know whether we gave a lot of answers. I think we explored a lot of territory. We have seen this year, just maybe as a closing remark, that in my area, some of our large-scale facilities, because of electricity costs, could not deliver the services. And so it's an issue, right? The financing is an issue, and we have to find ways that this is sustainable. Thank you very much. And yeah, here we are now ready for lunch. And we still have to do a little bit of homework to get some messages written down. Thank you.